Hey everybody, Jay Winters for University Lutheran here, and today we're talking about 100 Bible stories, and we're talking about specifically the stories about the patriarchs. And the stories about the patriarchs there's so many of them. There's 12 of them that we're going to distill this down into two separate videos. So part one and part two. Today we're going to be taking a look at part one. So let's dive into it. So the patriarch stories are the call of Abraham, the promise of Isaac, the Sodom and Gomorrah, the offering of Isaac, Isaac and his family, and Jacob's stairway. Now, one of the things about the patriarchs is that a lot of times if people ask you, who are the patriarchs? The patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so those are typically when somebody says who's the patriarchs of Israel or who are the patriarchs in the Bible, they're talking about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then later on in Genesis, you actually get this add-on because Jacob has 12 sons, but one of them is really important, and one of them kind of steals the show from everybody else. His name is Joseph, and that's going to be what we're talking about in part two. So you see the rest of the patriarch stories are Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is sold into slavery. Joseph serves Pharaoh, Joseph's brothers in Egypt, and Joseph revealed in Joseph's promise. So those are the things that we're going to be taking a look at over these two videos. But today, especially, we're going to be taking a look at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we're going to be taking a look at those in two different things. We're going to look at Abraham and Isaac, and then we're going to take a look at Isaac and Jacob. So let's dive into those stories. So Abraham and Isaac, there's three stories here, and the three stories, sort of as we group them together, they're all about Abraham and God's promise of Isaac. So we don't actually get to meet Isaac yet in any of these stories. We just know that Isaac is promised to be given to Abraham. So Abraham is the first of the patriarchs. He is promised by God that he will be the leader of a great nation and the father of a great nation, and then we get his promise. But he runs into some issues. He runs into specifically some issues in Sodom and Gomorrah. So let's dive into it here. So we've got the call of Abraham. So Abraham wasn't always Abraham. His name had been Avram or Abram. And so just his name alone kind of tells you a little bit about what's happening with him in the story of his promise. So the word Avram means father, but the word Avraham means great father or highly exalted father. It means sort of a father in a bigger sense. We might even think about it as being the difference between father and grandfather. And so there's kind of that sense of God coming to Abraham, and he promises him that he's going to be a great nation. And Abraham at first kind of can't believe this. He's like, how is that going to happen? And so that then dives us into this story of Isaac. So he promises that he's going to be a great nation, and then we're going to move on here to the promise of Isaac. So this is a really cool story because it appears that God himself visits Abraham. So in the story, you have three different messengers, three different men who arrive at Abraham's camp. And a lot of church historians have looked at this and they've said, wow, that's a lot like the three persons of the Trinity. And we don't know for sure if it's the three persons of the Trinity or if it's God in a human form accompanied by two angels or whatever it might be. But that's kind of a little bit of the sense here that God himself feels that Abraham and Sarah are such important people in his story that he visits them personally. And so Abraham sees them. He says, "Go and get everything that we need. Like bring 3 seahs of flour and go and kill the fatted calf." And he goes out of his way to make these people feel comfortable. And after they've all eaten and they're all hanging around, sort of like that feeling when you hang around after Thanksgiving. What happens there is that the three men, one of them says, "By this time next year, you're going to have a son." And of course, Sarah is sort of off in the background. She's not invited to the party. Normally speaking, only men would dine with men during this time. But she's sort of listening in, and she hears that and she laughs. And God notices that, and God says, "Is anything too powerful for God?" Meaning, like, is there anything too big for me to do? Even give this old woman, because they are very old people at this time, even give this old woman a baby boy, and so the name Isaac actually means laughing one or laughing boy, and it comes from this episode where God shows up to Abraham and he says, "Hey, I'm going to give you a son." And his wife laughs at him. So that's the promise of Isaac, and then we get finally the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah doesn't have anything to do with Isaac. What it has to do with is Abraham, and Abraham has been promised by God that if he follows God, what's going to happen is that God is going to lead him into this land that he has promised him. He said, "Follow me, pick up everything you've got, come and follow me, and just see where this goes." And so he splits between himself and Lot. So initially he takes Lot along with him, and Lot goes to one direction, and Abraham goes to the other direction. Now, the direction that Lot goes into is a direction that has a lot of great pasture land. It's a place with obviously a couple of cities, and it's kind of good land. And the place that Abraham goes to is sort of desolate desert land. But that desolate desert land means that Abraham is able to pay more attention to God. And Lot, he goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. And you probably recognize those names. Those names are historic cities that are up to no good. And we see what that is. I mean, the people in this city are actually sort of advocating for rape. Either raping the people that are brought to them, or even after a little while, they tell Lot, "Well, just give us one of your sons or your daughters or your maids, and we'll rape them." And Lot is like, "This is crazy. This is not good." And so because of that, Lot and his family escape, and God destroys the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for their evil. And that just gives you a picture that after last time we were talking about how the world is still filled with sin after the fall into sin, and this just shows how that continues to happen. So even though God rescues us time and time again, it's like sin is always there. Sin's always creeping at the back door. And so that's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. That's the stories of Abraham and Isaac. So now we're going to switch a little bit, and we're going to move to the stories of Isaac and Jacob. So the stories of Isaac and Jacob are the offering of Isaac, and then Isaac's family, and then Jacob's stairway. So you can see kind of those things line up there. So the first thing you get is the offering of Isaac. So this story, it seems kind of crazy. God has told Abraham, "Hey, I'm going to make you the father of a great nation." He has told Abraham, "I'm going to do it for you. It's going to be your own son, and I'm only going to give you one of them." His name is Isaac, by the way. And then he appears to Abraham, and he says, "By the way, I want you to sacrifice your son for me." Now, sacrifice here means that he wants him to burn him up, wants him to become nothing. And so Abraham is trying to figure out, okay, why would God ever want this to happen to me? And the writer of Hebrews later on in the New Testament says that Abraham thought that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. But what we find out is something different. What we find out is that Abraham, he ties Isaac down to the altar, and he's got the knife like ready to plunge into his chest. And then out of the sky, you hear the angel of the Lord cry out and say, "Stop, Abraham, don't do it. I have something else for you." And that fulfills something prophetic that Abraham says, because when Isaac says, "We've got the wood, we've got the fire, we've got the knife, we've got everything that we need, but what we don't have is the sacrifice." And Abraham says, God himself will provide the sacrifice. And that reminds us of what happens with Jesus, that Jesus is the sacrifice that's provided for us, that in order to make us a part of God's family, what God does is he actually sacrifices his own son. So what he called Abraham to do, and yet Abraham didn't do because God stopped him. God himself says, I'm going to do that for my own son. I'm going to sacrifice my own son for the sake of all of us, which is really great news. So then we're going to move on to Isaac's family. Now, Isaac's family, things start to get pretty crazy here. It's interesting that Isaac himself really is always sort of a secondary figure. He's always sort of a figure in a character in Abraham's story, or he's a character in Jacob's story, but he's not really ever a standalone figure. And so Isaac has these two sons, Jacob and Esau. They're twins. Esau means the red one, and Jacob's name means heel puller. Now, heel puller is sort of a thing that means kind of like, oh, he's a jokester, he's a prankster, he's somebody who, maybe you don't quite trust so much. And sure enough, that's the case for Isaac, because Isaac tricks Esau and tricks, or Jacob tricks Esau and tricks Isaac. Isaac is really old by this point and can't really tell the difference between his two sons. And he knows that Esau is this hairy, redheaded guy, probably, and that Jacob is different than that. It says he's smooth-skinned, and yet he's able to figure that out, and he actually sort of steals the birthright that is supposed to go to Esau. He kind of does it twice. The first time, Esau comes in from the field and says, "Man, I'm so hungry. I just want some of that stew." And Jacob says, "Well, I'll give it to you if you sell me your birthright." So he's already given it away. But then I don't know if Esau forgets about that or what. But then when it comes time to actually get that blessing, to get that birthright blessing, then when Jacob shows up instead of Esau, it's a huge deal. And so you have this sort of splitting up of families that Jacob now is super scared of Esau, because he's pretty sure that Esau is going to kill him. And so he goes running away. And as he goes running away, we get the story of Jacob's stairway. So then we get Jacob on the run, and he's on the run for a while. He stops at this place called Bethel, and he lays his head down. He goes to take a nap and to rest for the evening. And he has this dream where he sees he sees this thing that is this stairway or this ladder that's leading up to heaven, and going up and down the stairway is God's messengers, God's angels. And so it really gives us a picture that God is actively involved in human history, even though a lot of times we can't see that all the way. And so those are our stories for this part A video of the Patriarchs. Thanks for being here. We're going to do part B in just a little bit, and we'll talk about the stories of Joseph. Thanks much for being here. God bless. Bye-bye.